All right, so I've got all my parts laid out to start putting this transmission back together. I got some axle tubes painted up and I got some axles sitting over here. I thought it might be a good spot to show you how these side gears go together. Typically these side gears are in the transmission. They do slide right out. But you can see in here, there's a rounded slot on either side. And then you have these two pieces, they're called fulcrum plates. These slide in and they basically create a flat surface there for the axle to sit on. And then as the axle moves, they're able to rotate this way. So there's one on the top, one on the bottom. And they do wear out over time. These are not too bad. They've probably got a little bit of wear on them, but they're okay. I'm going to try to reuse them. This transmission's just getting a stock engine on it. I ended up having to find, this is an NOS one, because my other side wouldn't come apart. When you saw me take apart the transmission and pull the axles, you saw one of these slide out with the axle. And the reason that did that, I ended up having to actually put this in a press and press the axle out because the shaft was actually stuck in there. And you can see on this fulcrum plate, you can see all that pitting. It's really bad, and it's all pitted inside of here. I can only assume that some water or moisture or something got in there. It's on both sides too. It's probably the worst ones I've ever seen. And this one's actually rough to the touch. And the reason that this axle wouldn't pop out of here is because this was actually had rust pitting between it to the point that this was causing an area where it couldn't slide. It would rotate this direction, it would rotate back and forth, but this is pretty much just junk now. I have two more fulcrum plates coming from a friend, and then I'm going to get all this stuff back together. But I figured I'd show you how these kind of go together and what to do to measure them. Okay, so to put this whole system together here, the way these are designed, the axle is flat on either side. Same thing, these are in okay shape. They're kind of worn. I'm going to measure them just to check everything out. But you're going to take the fulcrum plate round side down into this side. The opposite, same thing. This can be a little tricky. It's gonna take me a second. Usually what I'll do is I'll put a glob of grease on there on each side after I've measured them and checked them. Just to hold them in place while I'm putting the axle together so they don't roll around. And if you kind of get them in there, you get a finger in there and get them to the sides, you can slip the axle in, usually. There you go. Okay. And with this in there, you can see the two fulcrum plates. You can see that the axle is going to rotate this way on its own because it's slightly rounded. And then back and forth, the motion is going to be done by the axle rotating in the fulcrum plates. To measure these and check to make sure that they're not oversized or anything, they have a spec of between the axle and the fulcrum plate is 6 thou to 8 thou. So I'm just going to take not the best feeler gauges. Take this, stick it down in there, and if you can get all the way in, you're good. So spec, it's kind of odd because most of the manuals you see, they say 6 thou to 8 thou. Here's an 8. And that's pretty tight there. I can't actually make it through to the bottom, and you check both sides. And then they tell you if you get to 12, which is funny that the range is 6 to 8, but if you get to 12, then the fulcrum plates are no good. The axle may be no good. Either way, there's some parts there that aren't any good and you need to replace them. So I usually do that. I usually start with an 8. If an 8 doesn't fit, then I know we're good. They're not going to be tighter than that if they're clean. And then I usually take the 12, and like the 12, I can just barely get into the very top lip of it. Yeah, I can't even get in. Yeah, there we go. Just barely get in there, but not all the way in. I'm basically just getting in and I'm turning the fulcrum plate is what's happening. I can't get straight down in. So this gear, the fulcrum plate and the axle all will work fine together. you have a little bit of movement, but that's just kind of the way these are for the most part. And that's it. I thought I'd just kind of go over that and just show you how these go together. It's real simple to measure them, so there's no point in not doing it. Here's the axle that went with that bad set of fulcrum plates and gear. This thing is toast. I mean, you can see those holes are, I mean, you can put a fingernail into them. They're so deep, you know what I mean? So I'm not really sure what caused it. It's literally the first time I've ever seen one that bad, but I guess it happens. So that's it. We'll start getting this thing assembled. All right. Before I put this other side, this is the other side of the transmission. Before I put the other side in, I figured I'd give you a look at what's happening in there. If I can get the right angle and the lights on it. You can see the two spider gears. You can see the inner part in there, the round thing, is the side gear I just put in. A little better focus. And you can see how this works. I'm rotating the axle as if the car was driving forward. If I rotate the transmission itself, this entire thing turns. See that? The whole differential rotates around. And you can see here, this is that area that I was telling you where the washer has the nub on the top, let's call it. But I figured I'd just show you what it looks like inside there. I'm actually going to rotate this so that that nub is at the top, just because it's easier for me to see when I go to put the other axle in, just so I know exactly where it is. That's all. Just figured I'd show you that. Kind of interesting to look at. Okay, so I'm gonna install this axle here. I've got my side gear, my two fulcrum plates. There's a few ways you can do this. You can slide the gear in, get the gear seated in there, and then get your fulcrum plates in and then slide your axle in. That's one direction you can take. The other way, you can get the fulcrum plates in place, get the axle in place, and then slide the whole thing in. Both have their positives and negatives to them. Sometimes the side gear doesn't just come out of the transmission, and then other times when you go to slide the axle in, the fulcrum plates move all over the place, and it causes a little bit of a issue that way getting things lined up. You can do it either way though. I did the other side with the gear in. And I'm going to do this side with the gear out. No particular reason, just to show both ways of doing it. So I put a little bit of grease inside the side gear. I put a little bit of grease on the fulcrum plates, and I'm going to put some on this axle. And this is just because I don't want everything dry. It's going to obviously get gear oil and everything in here, but it's just a little easier to slide everything in and get everything going. And if you look, these fulcrum plates will kind of stick in place. Once you get a little bit of grease on them, they may fall out, but they don't fall out as easy. And then when you go to plug this axle in, generally you can generally get this thing to plug right in. Without too much trouble, and they slide around, they'll rotate inside there, and that causes things not to fit when you go to get them in. All right, so there's that put together. We've got articulation both directions. So now I'm going to throw a little bit of grease on this too, just because. I'm a firm believer of things that should have oil on them when they're getting assembled too. So the only time you ever have an issue doing it this way is if that whole thing slides off before you get it in there, which I just got it in there, so that worked out good. But sometimes the side gear will just slide off, fall into there. Then your fulcrum plates fall down, and then you get to start over. Not a huge problem, but and as I showed you, there is a notch, a little kind of a bump. I don't know what I called it before, but in this washer, and this washer goes on next. I like to put things back the way they came apart, and you can see on this one, or maybe you can see on this one. I don't know if you can. It's kind of dirty on this side, and then it's got a real shiny section on the outside. The shiny section was what was in the had the snap ring on top of it. This is why that's shiny, is because the snap ring was sitting on top of this. So I try to put things back together the way they came out, especially if it's used stuff. If you were doing all new, then it probably would be fine here. And I've already rotated this over so that the little nub indent is up on top on this. You can do it anywhere you want. I just generally, I just pick a position and make sure I get it in the same position left and right, just so that I can, I know which way it goes on this particular install. And then you get the snap ring. This is a used snap ring. It's a Volkswagen snap ring. If you had a new one or whatever, you want to kind of look at them. Sometimes when these are stamped, you'll have one edge that's kind of a little bit rounded over and the other edge is sharp. You want the sharp edge facing out so that when it snaps in, it's got a good firm sharp edge to catch on. In this particular one, trying to see where my dirt is. I might have cleaned it up too much, yeah. Yeah, so this snap ring, this particular one, it doesn't, the edge looks the same on both sides. So I'm just gonna put it in where I can see a little bit of a groove here where this was sitting last time when it was in. And we'll get it the same way it was in there before. I mean, this snap ring was in this transmission for a long time. I don't know if these axles had ever been removed, so I would say probably not, based on the history of the car and the condition everything was in. And I'm just going to fish this in there. This can get a little tricky. I don't have the best snap ring pliers to use for this particular job, so we're just going to use what we've got and get it in there. So I'm going to tighten up my snap ring and pop the bottom in and then get the top section in. These are ratcheting snap ring pliers, so they sometimes that's good and then other times it's not. Sometimes you want to kind of be able to loosen it up, tighten it, and then rotate it a little bit so you can kind of see if everything's snapping in where it's supposed to be. And this is, so we've got the light in there a little better. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, let me show you that. All right, so if you can see in there, I've got the snap ring in and I've got it seated. And what you're looking for is, you just want the snap ring, there's a groove inside here. Let me get this to focus. There's a groove inside here that the snap ring sits in. You just want to make sure that it's all the way around, it's snapped into that groove, and you don't have an angle somewhere that's sticking out a little bit. Because obviously you don't want to, you know, the first time you step on the gas in this thing, you don't want this whole assembly to be popping out. I mean, what I'm doing right now is completely normal. What would happen is if the snap ring popped out and then the side gear would be able to come forward with this axle, and that would stop, obviously that would stop the car, but it would probably do some damage to it, probably grind up your spider gears and everything else, because it would be half engaged. So that's it. That's all there is to getting these axles into this transmission. And if we rotate the transmission, it should. I thought it was in neutral, but it may not be. Nope, it is. But if you rotate everything, you'll get movement, and you can see everything kind of rotates independently anyway. But so that's it for those. Okay, so next thing we got to do, now that these axles are in, is get the tubes on. Here's my tube all ready to go with the one-piece boot on it. The first thing you need to do, well, first of all, you want to make sure these tubes are left and right. You want to make sure that you've got the correct tube and you're putting it on there, because you'll find out real quick when you go to install the transmission that, you know, you got to pull everything back apart and change this back over. An easy way to tell is you've got this brake hose bracket should be facing towards the front of the car, and then you'll see this arm for the shock is also going to slightly face towards the front of the car. Obviously, if I tried to put it on the other side, that would face backwards. So that's the quick, easy way to tell whether it's the left side or the right side, is imagine it going into a transmission, and where is that brake hose bracket? All right. So first thing we've got to do here, let me get all this stuff together. I've already cleaned up the mating surface on the transmission, so we know that's clean. My axles are clean. So the first thing that happens to the transmission is we've got our flower, whatever I don't know what you want to call this thing. It's basically a spacer. It's a piece of plastic. It snaps over, and it gives it pretty much goes between the transmission and into this cup, and everything just gives it a little bit to slide on. I suppose it's probably designed so that this wears out before the two metal surfaces start rubbing each other and wear out, you know, that way. So this goes on here, slide it all the way up, and then it does snap in. Sometimes you'll hear it click, sometimes you won't, but it does snap in around the inside edge here. So that's in there. We've got a giant O-ring. The O-ring, at least on this axle anyway, this O-ring goes along here on the flange itself. Snap that O-ring into there. And then from there, we have gaskets that go on the transmission. Now, these are gaskets, but they also do a second job, and they're actually a spacer. And I'm sure you've heard this before if you watch transmission videos or read the service manual, but Volkswagen used to sell these. There was like a reddish colored brown one, and then these tan ones, and they were actually different thicknesses. What you're trying to get is you're trying to get this axle mounted up, and you're trying to not have this axle have more than 1/8 thou of play in and out on between this flange inside here and this area right in here. So if this is worn or you have too many shims, then you're going to push this whole entire, it's going to allow this to be looser when this flange is on, and you'll have more play. Take out shims or buy a new one of these where it's nice and thick and it hasn't worn down at all, and that's going to give you less play. What I like to do is you can count the gaskets that came off the transmission is one way of doing it, and you can see if they're reddish brown or if they're the tan ones. You can measure the gaskets that come off. If you can get it off and you've got at least an area that's clean, usually you can get on the inside because this edge will have dirt on it, and you can measure how the thickness of this, and they're relatively thin. It's probably like 1 to 2 thousandths. And that's a good way to measure it. If you're just putting the exact same axle, this back on, everything's exactly the same, and you're just cleaning it up, or maybe this is leaking and that's why you're replacing them. You can do it that way just by measurement if you're unsure of the feel of it. Or once you kind of do this a few times, you kind of get a feel for what a loose one is and what a tight one is. These gaskets go on with, you'll see some people put some sealant on them and stuff. The problem with sealant, if you wanted to use like a high-tack sealer, it's at least thin. I'm not gonna here. I generally don't. If this, unfortunately, you won't know until it leaks, but if it leaks on me, Then I may come back, you know, when I pull it back apart, I would maybe put some high tack sealer on it just to kind of gum that up a little bit. This transmission still has a little bit of wet, like kind of oil left inside that edge. I cleaned it off, but I had taped up everything, so it remained clean inside there when I painted it. So I'm going to assemble this completely dry. And if it's the first time that you're putting the thing together to check the play, it should be dry anyway. Get this stuff out of the way. Boot out of the way, get this out of the way. Try not to push the kite too far away. This thing locked. Yep. Okay. And then it's literally as simple as just getting that flange on there. I'm going to put some wood back underneath this just to support this axle. And I'm kind of in a funny position, but there we go, a little bit. I probably have the transmission up too high on this side. I can possibly pull it down some. Okay. And you don't want to screw up your gaskets. So get this in. And then what you have is 6 studs going around. You have a washer, it's like a wavy washer, and a nut on each one of these. I'm going to get one on kind of quick here to hold this together. Yeah, I'm just up pretty high here. Let me extend this out. Okay. All right, let me get on this side, a little easier. So we'll get our washers in, get our nuts started. And I'm going to tighten these up just loosely because they do have there is a torque specification on it of 14 foot-pounds. So, and I'm going to do a crisscross pattern. So I just did the top, I'm going to do the bottom, and then I'll kind of work my way around just to get this thing seated. So obviously this is one of those times where it's take your time, and it's worth a few extra minutes to make sure you get everything lined up right, so that you don't have a leak later, because this is not really something you can do when the transmission's installed. You would pretty much have to pull the transmission out again to reseal this if that ended up happening to you where it was leaking. A lot of the time, if it is just lightly leaking, you can kind of go through and retorque these, maybe give them 1 or 2 more foot-pounds just to kind of tighten them up if you've got leaks happening. But for the most part, if it's leaking, it's coming back apart, so. Okay, 1 more. Okay, so now I'm gonna go around, same idea, I'm gonna tighten these up in a crisscross pattern to 14 foot-pounds. This bottom one can be a little tricky when you're either on the floor or on a cart or whatever you have, you know, on a table, workbench, something. The little tough getting in there, but not a big deal. And I have a 3-inch extension on here just to make it a little easier. It's not like it's a super critical thing, torquing this down. So I'm okay with the slight variance that the extension is going to give me on a torque wrench. All right. I like to go through one more time and just make sure I didn't miss one somewhere. Okay, so now, with that torque down, we can now check and make sure that this axle doesn't have too much play in it. You want to move it around. You don't feel any spots binding, then you know you're not too tight. And then not the shaft, not the axle shaft, but just the tube. You're trying to see if there's any play in here. I know this probably isn't the most accurate way to do this, but I feel no play. Now, we're only talking 0.08 of an inch, so it's really not that much. But I know between measuring the old shims, this is all cleaned up. Everything's dry right now, so I know that everything's, you know, if there's movement here, it's real movement. It's not just movement because it's greased up. So I'm pretty confident that this is accurate. Read your service manual, you know, check up on this and make sure that you're doing this the right way. But that's the way I've done it for a long time, and I've never had a problem doing it this way. So like anything that you watch someone else do, that you should always kind of take it with a grain of salt and make sure that you do your due diligence to know that you're doing it correctly. So with these one-piece boots, I like to get this first one started, the inner joint. Sometimes it helps to move it around to kind of pop it in there. All right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my inner clamp on, and I'm going to leave my outer clamp loose. I'll get it in position, but I'm going to leave it loose. And the reason I'm doing that is because obviously this axle needs to be rotated to get it in the car, and you want as much slack on there when you're installing this, so that you can kind of, if you have to rotate the axle out of the way and then spin it once you get it in there a little bit, then you can do that. If you tighten down the outer clamp on the boot, then it's not going to be possible to do that. And then you'll just be loosening it back up again anyway. So when you tighten up clamps, you always want to pay attention to where this clamp's going to land. So you've got the worm gear, you've got a screw or a bolt or whatever sticking out the end, and then at some point, these are actually really nice clamps. They came with these German boots, so I assume they're German clamps. But at some point, you're going to end up with a tab sticking out on the clamp. So I always kind of take a minute and look at what's going to be around this thing and what's going to be in the way, or where am I going to rip my hand open later on it because I, go underneath the car to do something else and I got this tail hanging off of it, or the bolt itself, or whatever it is, something in the way. So I know on this side I've got a clutch cable that's going to come through here. So I'd prefer not to have this in that position. It's just getting too close to another part. And then I don't like to put them all the way down. In this case, the transmission's lower, so it's not that big of a deal. I don't want it here because I'm never going to get something in there to do this. You got to remember, if you ever have to take this clamp off, obviously if the transmission's installed, you wouldn't be able to do a one-piece boot. You'd have to do a split boot if you had to replace it down the road. But make sure that this clamp is in a position that you can actually access it. So I'm just going to twist it back this way. And I may, when I get this installed, if this is too close to the frame horn, when I go to install this, I'll loosen up the clamp and just give it a little bit of a rotate, just to make sure that it's in a position that you know, you could take it off while the transmission's in the car from underneath or wherever. I'm pretty sure that this direction, kind of heading straight down, I'll be able to, you know, hopefully I never have to put a clamp on it, but if I mean another boot on it, but you know how that works, so. But I figure if I get it straight down, I can get a screwdriver up through and unscrew it and between the frame horn and the transmission, so. Just get this thing, make sure this boot's popped on there all the way, and just tighten it down. Okay. And then I'll get the outer clamp just on the tube. I have to obviously separate them to get them on there. I'll get that on the tube and then just kind of leave it loose, just so I know you don't lose it that way, and it's on there, so you can flip it on when you start putting this thing in. But that's it. That's pretty much all there is to installing these axles. At least getting the axle and the tube on the transmission. I'll show you when we get to it. I'll show you the putting bearings in the end of it and sealing all that up. And we'll go from there on it.